Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast and thanks for tuning in to part 2 of this two-part Q&A, which is all about nutrition. So, picking up from where I left off, I'm going to move on to the first nutrition-related question, which is, what should your weight goal be? Which is a great question. Now, in my practice, I don't encourage my clients to aim for a weight goal, even if you were that body weight in the past. And I'll explain why. If you've never been at that weight, then you have no idea how you're going to feel or look. So you're just pulling the number out of your ass, really, aren't you? And even if you were there before, that was likely a different life, especially if you were that weight when you were a teenager or when you were in college, and now it's been 20 years since then. Moreover, hopefully, if you've been training since then, you now have more muscle. So you're going to look and feel different at that weight. And if you have more muscle, you may well be heavier now and yet feel and look better than you did back then because you've packed on that extra mass. So instead of having a goal weight, what I would do is consider health, aesthetics, and sustainability. So health. What's a healthy weight? I use several tools to gauge this. One tool is BMI. So a healthy weight is considered normal on the BMI scale, and in the UK that corresponds to 19.5 to 24.9. And the scale is a little bit different in every country, but roughly it will be between 20 and 25. Obesity is classified as a BMI of 30 plus for non-Asians, whereas Asians are known to have a different body composition than other racial or ethnic groups, which is why obesity is defined at a lower cutoff point for them. So depending on your ethnicity, you will want to look at the specific ranges for normal BMI and for overweight and obese BMIs on Google. But BMI is only one aspect of health, which doesn't take into account the difference between muscle mass and body fat. It only looks at body mass as a whole. So it's limited, and that's why I bring in other tools to complement BMI, because it's limited, but it isn't useless. It's just that it needs a little bit of support from these other tools. And I use blood pressure and specific blood markers like your insulin, your HbA1c, sex hormones, as well as your thyroid hormones, your cortisol, and several other hormones that are involved within your well-being, because fat loss has been shown to benefit all of them. Another tool I use is your waist circumference. And again, because body fat distribution depends on ethnicity, you want to Google the specific cutoff points for waist circumference and relative risk to your health. And again, because body fat distribution depends on your ethnicity, but also on your sex assigned at birth, you're going to want to look up on Google the specific cutoffs for waist circumference relative to health risk for your specific ethnic group and sex assigned at birth. The second factor I'm going to consider is aesthetics. And that's very personal. I'm never going to go to a client and stop their fat loss phase when I think that they look aesthetic. Your sense of aesthetic is your own. But what I would caution you against is to chase aesthetics at the expense of health and sustainability, which is the third factor I typically look at. Because you can try to pursue a degree of leanness that's not sustainable for you and that actually is counterproductive to your health. For example, bodybuilders get to the limits of leanness that a human can achieve, but they also know, if they have the right relationship with the sport, that they're only doing it as part of the sporting activity, which is competing in bodybuilding. And once they're done competing, they do their best to get back to a healthier body composition and to regain some of the body fat they have lost. Because at that very low body fat level, they are compromising health and sustainability. So moving on to the third factor, again, sustainability, you need to consider the body composition at which you feel your best. And I have talked your ear off in other podcast episodes about the model that I use when addressing sustainability. And that's the dual intervention point model by Speakman and colleagues. And I love it because it gives you a range of body fat percentages to move within, whereby there's going to be a lower body fat intervention point below which your body will actively fight against further fat loss. You will be hungry. You will be focused on food all the time. You will be very anxious. You won't be able to sleep. You will be cold. You won't be able to focus. You'll be so tired all the time. And you'll be very critical of your physique, even though realistically you're probably the leanest you've ever been. And then there's an upper intervention point that is a body fat percentage above which your body actively fights against more weight gain because it no longer feels like it's healthy. So you want to settle somewhere in between these two intervention points on a body composition where you feel like you've achieved the aesthetics that you're happy with while also being healthy and able to sustain your current body weight. And that's how I would look at your end goal for a fat loss phase. Not so much a specific weight, but more so a combination of your health, the way you feel in your body, the way you look, and how sustainable your body composition is. The second question that I have today is, why can't I stick to any diet? This is a very broad question, and there could be a gazillion reasons. But when I had this conversation with the person who originally asked this question, it emerged that they had tried a lot of different diets. And at first, it seemed like they were doing relatively well, but then eventually they would, in their own words, fall off and never actually get back to it. If that's the case, then the reason is your mindset. So I strongly encourage you to listen to episodes 1 to 4 of this very podcast, because those are primer episodes where I talked about the skills and the mindset that you need to lose fat and to keep it off. However, I am not just going to leave it here and say, hey, listen to the podcast and thank you and goodbye. I am going to give you a little bit more of an insight into what I mean by mindset. What I find with the majority of my clients who start working with me and report this problem is that they are dieting as a form of self-punishment to fix their body or to fix themselves. And when they're not dieting, they're eating whatever they want. Then they feel guilty about the food they've been eating because they think it's bad food, and then eat even more because they've ruined it now, because they've been eating whatever they wanted. You use dieting as a form of punishment, which means that your mind subconsciously rebels against your desire to diet because you're depriving it of food. You also have a bad food versus good food mindset. So you feel guilty for eating certain food and you feel like a saint for eating other food when all food is neutral. It is literally just food. And as a result of this combination of factors, you are unable to stick to any approach, no matter how sustainable it may look like on paper. And with a client like this, what I would do is I wouldn't focus immediately on fat loss, but I would focus on body image work, which I don't think you can do at the same time as dieting for fat loss, because dieting for fat loss increases the risk of developing a poor body image. So it has a lot of benefits, but you want to engage in it once your body image is solid enough that you're lowering the risk of worsening it by going through fat loss. And I know it's really frustrating because right now you think that you're going to develop a better body image if you can diet to the physique that you envision for yourself. But that's not the case, because we know that people can have really poor body image irrespective of BMI, weight, and body composition, whereby even really lean people that you would expect feel super confident and happy with their body can have really bad body image. So you can't diet your way to feeling the way that you want to feel. And right now, feeling like crap about yourself is the reason why you're unable to diet. So it's by fixing the way that you feel about yourself that you're going to be able to finally stick to any diet that you want. I really sympathize with the people who feel this way, because all of us have a body image, and I'm no stranger to struggling with it. I've had a restrictive eating disorder, so arguably you could say I've had worse body image than the average person who hasn't had an eating disorder. So I completely understand how difficult it is to work on your body image, but it's also really worth it. Question number 3 for today is, can I have higher and lower calorie days in a bulking phase? Now, when answering this question, I'm going to assume that you're in a surplus, because the person I spoke to about this was in a surplus. Now, in theory, yes, you can have higher and lower calorie days. However, in practice, I would avoid extremes. For example, I would avoid having a 6,000 calorie day and then saving calories for that and therefore placing yourself in a deficit for a day or two. Because although across the week you might be in a surplus overall, on the day you were in a deficit, whether it was a training day or a rest day, you might have compromised either your training performance or your recovery. So you inadvertently compromised muscle growth to a very small degree. Now you could argue, okay, but I'm still in a surplus, so ultimately it doesn't matter all that much. And while that may be the case, that overall you're losing 1% of the results you could have gained, I think it's also worth avoiding extremes from a psychological perspective, because you're not in a surplus to eat however much you want, to overeat until you're stuffed and bloated, to give yourself permission to have a programmed binge almost, because that's going to develop a poor relationship with food. You are eating in a surplus to support muscle growth, which includes supporting your performance on training days and supporting your performance on rest days. So from a practical perspective, if you wanted to have higher and lower calorie days, I wouldn't borrow any more than 10% of your calories from any one day. So if you're in a surplus at 2,500 calories, that would look like borrowing up to 250 calories from one day to add it on top of another day. So on one day you could go as low as 2,250 and the next day as high as 2,750. So it's nothing crazy, and it's still going to enable you to have that flexibility that it sounds like you're looking for without compromising your mindset around being in a surplus. The final question I'm going to answer in this podcast is going to be, why are other people losing weight faster than me? And I'm definitely going to give you the reasons. But first I want to ask you, why does this even matter? There is no fastest dieter award, and comparing yourself to other people doesn't do anything but make you feel frustrated. it's not going to help you. It's not going to change the reality, which is that for you right now, the rate of fat loss that's happening is the rate of fat loss that's happening. So, in my view, comparing yourself to others in this way is only detrimental to your motivation, which will then be detrimental to your consistency. And consistency is the number one priority to get the best possible results. Beyond that, there are a number of factors that are going to affect how fast you can lose body fat. The first one is, well, they're in no particular order really, but the first one I'm going to cover is the size of your caloric deficit. If somebody is in a larger deficit, they are going to lose weight at a faster rate than you. And that may be a larger deficit because they're eating fewer calories relative to their maintenance calories. For example, they could be in a 20% deficit. So 20%, they took away 20% of their maintenance calories from their current diet, and you might only be in a 10% deficit. Or it could be that they're doing more physical activity and thus burning more calories from that physical activity that then increases the size of the deficit. Even though they may be eating a similar amount of calories, they might be in the same 10% calorie deficit from their diet, but then they're in a greater deficit than you as it pertains to their energy expenditure. The second factor to take into account is sex assigned at birth, because there are important differences in metabolism between the two sexes, and also important hormonal differences that are going to make fat loss more challenging for people assigned female at birth. Now, if you are on testosterone because you are a trans man, that's going to make it a little bit easier to lose body fat compared to an AFAB person who's not on testosterone, but it's not going to be as easy as if you were AMAB. Vice versa, if you were AMAB, but you are a trans woman and you are on estrogen, it is going to get harder for you to lose body fat, but probably not as hard as if you had been assigned female at birth. And the three main differences between the sexes that make fat loss easier for AMAB people include body composition, size, and the presence of the menstrual cycle, and therefore of hormonal fluctuations in an AFAB body. In terms of body composition, people assigned male at birth have a greater proportion of muscle mass and a lower proportion of body fat, which helps increase their metabolism, and it helps them burn more calories. Even if you were an AFAB person and you were comparing yourself to an AMAB person who's the exact same size as you, they would have a faster metabolism because they have more muscle mass at baseline than you do and less body fat. So you weigh exactly the same, but you're both 100 kilos, but they carry 80 kilos of muscle and 20 kilos of fat, and you carry 60 kilos of muscle and 40 kilos of fat. Now, your metabolism is going to be slower because of that difference in body composition, given that muscle mass burns more calories than fat tissue does. The second difference is size, because AMAB people tend to be much taller and bigger than AFAB people, and obviously this means that they burn more calories. Irrespective of sex, a bigger body is going to require more calories, so they can also lose weight faster because they have more weight to lose, and they are larger. The final factor is the presence of the menstrual cycle and of hormonal fluctuations. These can mainly affect consistency from a psychological perspective and from a physiological perspective as well, in that having a menstrual cycle, especially if you have strong symptoms around PMS and or during your period, is harder than not having one. While AMAB people and people without a period tend to feel pretty even-keeled hormone-wise throughout the month, you are experiencing hormonal fluctuations that make you hungrier, more tired, and therefore it makes it harder for you. These fluctuations make it harder for you to stay consistent with your calorie deficit. So it's possible that you're comparing yourself to people who are able to be more consistent than you because they don't have to contend with these hormonal fluctuations. That's why, personally, I no longer have a period, and I work with both AMAB and AFAB clients, people with a period and people without. And I respect the people who have a period and who have really strong symptoms when they're able to be as consistent as somebody without these symptoms in a fat loss phase, because it is goddamn hard. I can observe the difference between clients and between myself and people with a period, and it is objectively harder. So well done for sticking with it. Another consideration to make is the speed of your metabolism, again, irrespective of sex. As I discussed in episode 116 with Dr. Eric Trexler, there are two metabolic phenotypes, a spendthrift phenotype and a thrifty phenotype. What this means is that some people, the people with the spendthrift phenotype, are more likely to expend energy, whereas the people with a thrifty phenotype are more likely to conserve more energy when doing the same activity. So let's say that I have a spendthrift metabolism and I run for 30 minutes. I burn 400 calories in these 30 minutes. That is a huge amount of calories for a 30-minute run, but let's say that's true. Whereas somebody with a thrifty metabolism, if they were the same size as me, the same sex assigned at birth, the same status of being on testosterone, the same everything, but the only difference was that they had a thrifty metabolism, they could burn only 300 calories on this 30-minute run. So now there's a 100-calorie difference between the amount of calories we can both burn during this 30-minute activity. And that is going to affect how fast you can lose body fat, because it is going to affect your calorie expenditure and therefore the size of the deficit that you can achieve. The next consideration to make is that there are different levels of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, between people. Not only that, but it's also been found in research that it seems like when people undergo metabolic adaptation as they lose body fat, it's not so much their basal metabolic rate that decreases, so the amount of energy they burn in a resting state just to keep themselves alive. It seems to be their NEAT that goes down by a large degree, up to 80 to 90% in some cases, which can lead to a fat loss plateau. First of all, NEAT is any type of activity that we perform subconsciously. This could be non-intentional steps, it could be blinking, fidgeting, anything that you're not really conscious of, that's your NEAT. And NEAT is largely dependent on your genetics. There are some people who are always fidgeting, they're always moving around, they seem to have this nervous energy about themselves. They tend to burn a lot of calories via NEAT. And then there are people who never move, and they don't burn many calories via NEAT. So now that you know about what NEAT is and about this research on how when people go through a diet and they experience metabolic adaptation, then NEAT tend to decrease more than other metrics, what do you make of this? I strongly encourage you to rely on your step count. As I've said, steps are typically classified as NEAT, so you can't really control how much you fidget, how fast you talk, how fast you walk, because it's subconscious, but you can control how many steps you do. So if you are going through a diet, stay on top of your step target. First of all, assign yourself a step target and stay on top of it, because this will prevent such a huge drop in NEAT, as large as 80 to 90% in research, as I've just stated, that is going to lead to a slowdown in your rate of fat loss and therefore a fat loss plateau. But also, if you're not already implementing a step target, that's likely going to speed up the rate at which you are losing body fat, because it's possible that right now, if you're comparing yourself to other people losing more body fat or faster than you, it may be because they have a greater need, whether they have a step target or whether it's simply based on their own individual genetics. Last but not least factor to consider is your exercise activity levels. EAT, exercise activity thermogenesis. So how many calories are you burning from regimented exercise? So this isn't NEAT, which is more non-regimented and subconscious. This is the exercise that you are actually doing. And if we're being super nitpicky, having a step target does mean that it is regimented exercise, but let's not be super nitpicky for a second. Let's stick with the definition that's typically used in research, which is exercise like cardio and resistance training, or any sport that you may play, and so on. These all count towards your EAT, your exercise activity thermogenesis. And if somebody else is losing weight faster than you, it may be because they're doing more exercise than you. Ultimately, if the rate at which you are losing body fat bothers you, there are only two ways to increase it. Either you do more exercise or more steps, or you lower your caloric intake, or a combination of the two, which is actually my favorite, because we don't want to lower your caloric intake so much that now you can't stick to the diet because it's just too restrictive. And we don't want to increase your energy expenditure from exercise so much that now you're always fatigued, you're always tired, you're not putting enough effort into your resistance training, which means you're not going to build as much muscle. A combination of the two is where it's at, from my perspective, because you're going to be able to do enough activity to burn calories towards fat loss, but also to preserve and support your resistance training performance and make the most out of your resistance training program. And also you're going to be able to keep your calories at such a level that you don't feel deprived. The diet doesn't become a form of restriction that weighs down on you, but you can still be flexible, or as flexible as is realistic in a fat loss phase. You can still enjoy the process and, most importantly, be consistent with it. And with that said, that is the end of my nutrition-related questions for this Q&A. Thank you once again for tuning in. Thank you to my clients and my followers for inspiring these questions and having these thought-provoking conversations with me. As always, if you want to work with me or if you want to connect with me, the links are all in the show notes. If this was helpful, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star rating, 5 stars only, because that's how great I am, because it really helps the podcast rank higher, and highest ranking podcasts are able to attract better guests because the guest sees the value of the platform. Therefore, I want to thank everyone who already has left a rating or a review. And on that note, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I will talk to you next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.